Annie Ross was strangled to death in her Southern California apartment. Her murder had gone unsolved for more than 30 years. But cops were honing in on a person of interest, Larry Stevens. And it was his ex-wife who gave them some valuable insight into who this man was.
As indicated by Francis, where there were times when he would try to choke her out. He would get so upset at her, he would grab her around the neck and choke her and strangle her to the point where she couldn't breathe.
Engen and Bracciodetta felt they were definitely on the right track, but their hands were tied. They had no way to connect him physically to Annie's murder. Stevens had been arrested a few times in the past, but his DNA wasn't in the national database, so all they could do was wait. Years went by, then a California law helped end that wait.
We knew that Proposition 69 was in effect, so we knew that if he was picked up for a felony, that his DNA would be collected. So it was all about patience at this point.
Then last May, the team got the break they and past generations of investigators had been waiting for.
I got a call from the crime lab, and she said, "Captain Engen, we received a hit notification for your 1974 homicide." And the words that came out of my mouth was, "Is it Larry Stevens?" And she says, "Larry Stevens."
2 months before, Larry Stevens' DNA was collected after he was arrested for domestic violence against his current wife. The time had finally come to interview Stevens. So Engen and Bracciodetta traveled to the Bay Area, where Stevens was living. The meeting, a long time in the making, was videotaped by an investigator from the district attorney's office.
They've been sitting down interviewing him now for about 15 minutes. Now his arms are crossed. Voice is going up a little bit.
While we were talking to Larry, our goal was to keep him talking. He gave us some great statements. Although he didn't confess to the crime, he told us enough to where he had nothing to do with anybody in that apartment complex. He had no reason to be in that apartment complex.
Then, Larry changed his story.
Larry confirmed that he would frequently visit that apartment complex.
As the interview progressed, it became clear that he was an individual resigned to his fate. I think maybe what he was thinking was what took so long.
When Paul and I knew that we were going to conclude our interview, I pulled a picture out of my briefcase of Annie and had him look at it. And Larry looked at it and said, "I recognize her." And we thought, "Really? Who is she?" He said, "That's the neighbor of Samantha Stevens from the show Bewitched." And then Paul looked at him and said, "Well, not quite. I'm showing you a picture of somebody that I believe you murdered 41 years ago. So take a real good look at that picture. Because you're not going home. You're coming with us."
Stevens was then placed under arrest.
My only words to him were simply, "You're under arrest for murder." And he had little to no reaction to those words.
On Monday, authorities from Orange County arrested 65-year-old Larry Stevens at his home here at the Sequoia Gardens Mobile Home Park in Santa Rosa. Stevens is accused of killing then 30-year-old Patricia Ross in 1974.
When I first saw Annie Ross's picture in the newspaper after they arrested Larry, I took one look at her picture and said, "Oh my God, he's murdered me."
Larry Stevens' ex-wife believes she was Larry's intended target, but he found in Annie Ross a more convenient victim.
I last saw him that May. This is December. I feel that in those few months, it was brewing. And because he could not get to me, and he saw this girl who was much like me, he took her as me and he killed her. She was an innocent victim of a madman.
There is nothing about his alleged assault on Annie Ross that would explain why he bled. Well, it turns out there's a hero in this case, one that happens to have 4 paws.
Really, the unsung hero in this whole saga could be this little dog, Jody, who was the lone survivor.
Remember Annie's dog, Jody? She had been put in the dresser drawer at the time of her murder. Many believe she bit Larry Stevens, causing him to bleed and leave his DNA at the scene. And without that evidence, an arrest may never have been made.
It's my belief that in trying to protect her, the dog probably bit Stevens and punctured, and that's where we get our drops of blood that 40 years later solve the case.
And Yellen says the other heroes come from the La Palma Police Department.
Little Police Department did some big work. They didn't let it go. In 1974, they were thorough. They didn't let it go as a cold case. They followed up on every single piece of evidence we thought they might be able to lead to. They never met Annie Ross, but in their minds, they know a nice girl that's life was taken too soon, and it motivated them and they committed to it.
For Bracciadetta and Engen and all who came before, it's Annie who kept them fighting all these years to bring an accused killer to justice.
What I would say to Annie is this: Annie, we grew to know you, we grew to love you, and we never gave up on you. May you rest in peace.
A real case in point here, I think, that for many officers, this does become much more than a job. Now, Stevens, a retired postal worker, was sentenced to 16 months in jail for misdemeanor spousal battery and felony obstructing an executive officer for his most recent domestic violence incident. If convicted on the murder charge, he faces a maximum sentence of life in state prison.